All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you to today's event. Before we get started, I just have a few quick notes. First of all, we are simultaneously live streaming this event as we're presenting it in person. So if you are one of the lucky folks who are watching us from your laptop on Facebook Live, please know that if you have questions during the talk, please just type them into the comment section underneath the video that you're watching right now, and we'll be sure to ask them after Dr. Brain's presentation. For those of you who are lucky enough to be here live face to face, we have a very special treat for you. We would like you to take a sticker on your way out. We have Institute for the Humanities stickers by both of the doors. The Institute for Humanities would like you to have that sticker featuring our mascot, Hugh Manatee. Get it? Yeah, because humanity is everywhere, and we want to make sure that humanity is everywhere as well. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Stephen Brain is an associate professor here at Mississippi State University in the Department of History. His specialty is on Soviet Russia and environmentalism and forestry. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Dr. Brain.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming out today. It's a difficult time of the day for some people to get here, and so I appreciate it. I'm glad to see so many people in attendance today because this is an important topic. With the invasion of Ukraine, world history has entered a new phase, I think, or perhaps more accurately, the world has been in a new post-Cold War phase for quite some time, and the invasion is alerting the United States to the fact that we are in that new phase. Often, we're beginning to see the contours of what 21st century history will be like. When I teach European history classes, I stop in 1991, not because things haven't happened since 1991, but because that's the last point where we can assess. The story comes to an end in 1991. There's another story happening now, and this is part of that story, the contours of what makes this 21st century different. It's starting to emerge. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm also glad you're here. Because from what I can tell, the news coverage about the invasion of Ukraine tends to talk about the situation without much historical context. From what I can tell, it's very much what's happening today and maybe a prediction about what will happen in the future. But in order to understand the war, in order to understand what's happening, historical context is absolutely necessary. And there's a lot of historical context to this situation. There's 1,000 years of history, if not more. And I'm going to try to hit the high points during this lecture. The real story has more twists and turns than I will be able to talk about here today because I only have a short time. There will be details that I need to omit, and I hope that doing so won't damage the narrative thread. And I, of course, welcome the chance to answer questions. Okay, my objective here today is to explain as best I can the decision of Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine about a month ago and what his objectives are so far as that I can describe them. He has given two reasons, one based on current politics and one based upon history. The one based upon current events is on his claim that Ukraine has been taken over by fascists or by Nazis and that Russia is attempting to liberate the country. I won't focus on this part of, on this reason of his, and I don't take this argument very seriously personally, in part because Russian leaders have a long history since World War II of using the term Nazi to describe any of their opponents, regardless of the situation. And I also find the claims about denazifying the Ukraine, or I should say Ukraine, unconvincing because the Ukrainian president is Jewish and members of his family died in the Holocaust. Now, this is not to say that there are not right-wing paramilitary groups active in Ukraine today, like the Azov Battalion, pictured here. Such white supremacist groups do exist in Ukraine, just as they do in the United States and also in Western Russia. However, these are private groups, and liberal doctrine requires countries to recognize the rights of their citizens to assemble freely, at least until someone is hurt. However, Vladimir Putin considers the existence of the Azov Battalion and other such paramilitary groups as grounds for military action because of his second reason for the invasion, which I'll talk about and will be the focus of my talk today. The second reason for invading Ukraine is the assertion that Ukraine is not a real country, not a real independent country with its own historical past, but properly that it's part of Russia, and it should be reunited with Russia as soon as possible. He has been saying this for years. This is not a new development, and apparently it's a sincere belief. In order to understand this argument more concretely, perhaps I could ask you to imagine what might happen as a thought experiment if the United States fell apart because of domestic tensions into three countries. Then there will become an independent country in the Northeast called Atlantica, perhaps, and the states on the Pacific Ocean might form a new country called Pacifica, and there'll be a country remaining in the middle that I'll call the American Confederation. It's an alternate history I'm asking you to imagine. It's not that hard to imagine something like this happening. And imagine that after a generation or so, Pacifica began making trade deals with China, or that Atlantica expressed interest in joining a European military alliance, and that it might not host German or French military bases near Boston or New York City. Hypothetical leaders of the American Confederation might argue that Pacifica and Atlantica are not real countries, that they emerged together, that they were part of the United States of American history, that they were maybe historical accidents or mistakes, and they must not be allowed to leave the American sphere of influence and join the Chinese or the European sphere of influence. Even if violent conquest is required, you could imagine a future president of the American Confederation insisting that these breakaway states return to the American sphere of influence. That is not that different from what's happening now in Ukraine. Putin published an essay, it's freely available on the internet, and it's been translated into English, stating that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, not two, that Ukraine was a 20th century invention related to Soviet history, and that the separation of Russia and Ukraine was a terrible historical tragedy, not an inevitability. In fact, he claimed that Russia was robbed when Ukraine was separated from the Soviet Union when it fell. My contention is that he has half a point. Ukraine and Russia do indeed have deeply intertwined histories. The word Ukraine itself means on the border, as in on the border of Russia. Russia was customarily called in the 18th and 19th centuries New Russia or Little Russia. The Ukrainian and Russian languages are very closely related. They are mutually intelligible, and they are more closely related than Spanish and Portuguese, for instance. This ethnographic map from 1914 doesn't even show Ukrainian as an ethnicity at all. The pink shades are places where Slavic people live. The light yellow is where people of Turkic derivation live, and there's a small area in the very far west for Polish people in a darker pink. But it's historically speaking, Ukrainians and Russians were not seen to be separate ethnicities. Ukraine has never been an independent country until about 30 years ago. It was always part of some other empire until 1991. So in this lecture, I'm going to discuss that intertwined history that provides Putin with his support for his argument. But in that same essay, Putin also asks a rhetorical question that he thinks has no answer, which is how can a shared heritage between Russia and Ukraine be divided? And who would want to do it and why? And I'll try to answer that question too, because there are people, specifically Ukrainian nationalists, who don't want to be part of the Russian nation state. And they're showing so every day, as we see in the news. Just quickly, some geography for those of you who don't know. This is a map of the Soviet Union. It consisted of 15 republics. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, those 15 republics became independent countries. Russia is the pink one. It was the largest by far, and it is now the largest country in the world. Ukraine is the yellow country. It was the third largest country in the Soviet Union, third largest republic, I should say. Russia, of course, is much larger. It dwarfs Ukraine. But Ukraine is a big territory, approximately the size of Texas or France. In addition, Ukraine was the traditional breadbasket of Russia and the Soviet Union, and even today produces 12% of the world export of wheat, 16% of the world export of corn, and 18% of barley. It's an agriculturally crucial region, and people are predicting that food prices will climb this summer if Ukrainian harvests don't reach the market. In the eastern regions of Ukraine, there are valuable coal and iron deposits. Ukraine has 44 million people versus 140 million for Russia. And it's an economically and geographically important country. It appears that Putin does not want to see it break away and join the European sphere of influence. So now let's transition from geography to history. This is a map of Eastern Europe in the year 800 or so. The areas in green are occupied by people speaking Slavic languages, although the ethnicity of Slav didn't exist yet at the time. At this time, in the year 800, there was no country called Russia or Ukraine. In the lands of present-day Russia and Ukraine, here in the dark, there were isolated forest tribes, people living in villages, basically, with tribal names that perhaps you can see, like Krivichi, Dregovichi, Radomichi. Although by that time, there were organized civilizations around the Mediterranean, centered in Greece and Rome and Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Slavic tribes were illiterate. They had no political organization above the level of the village, no currency, no literature, no organized religion. They were living in the Stone Age at a time when other parts of the Mediterranean world had moved into the Iron Age. This isolation came to an end in about the year 800. A Viking group known as the Varangians began traveling through Slavic lands as part of their trade migrations. That is, they left their homelands in northern Europe and they went on trading routes all around Europe. The richest trading markets were located in Mesopotamia. The rivers, as it turns out, that one of the best ways to get from their homeland in northern Europe to Constantinople or to Baghdad was crossing Slavic lands. And there were rivers that then, and still do, crisscross this land, and one could get a boat from Scandinavia to Constantinople relatively easily by sailing on the rivers. These Varangians or Vikings would put wheels on their boats to portage between the rivers, but they could make most of the way on water courses by sailing into the Baltic, into the Gulf of Finland, down the Neva River, into Lake Ladoga, then portage to the Dnieper and down to the Black Sea. As they passed through, they demanded tribute from the people who lived in these regions. These isolated Slavic tribes who had no real way to resist because their level of technology and political organization was low. This went on, as archaeologists have been able to determine, for several generations in the 9th century. But then something happened, and historians still don't know what it was, but whatever it was created Russia. This is the official story as contained in the first book about Russian history called the Russian Primary Chronicle. Apparently, one day, the Slavs had enough of the Varangians crossing through their territory and taking tribute. They had enough of the demands for tribute and they chose to fight back, or at least that's the story that we have. As the story goes, the Slavs drove the Varangians back beyond the sea, and refusing them further tribute, they set out to govern themselves. But there was no law among them, and they began to war against one another. And they said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." And they went overseas to the Varangian Rus, or the Vikings. These particular Vikings were known as the Rus, just as some are called Swedes, others called Normans, Angles, and Goths. And they said to the people of Rus, "Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Now, this story does not seem very likely. This does not conform to most people's understanding of human nature, that one group would throw off the control of another and then invite them back as rulers. May have happened, none of us were there, but it seems unlikely. No group called the Rus has ever been found. Of course, we all know where the Swedes and the Normans and the Angles and the Goths were, but no group name called the Rus has ever been found in any document. However, this is the story found in Russian history books. This is the foundational myth of Russia. After being invited, according to the story, the Varangians set up their first capital in the far north, not too far from Scandinavia, at Novgorod, in the very upper left-hand corner of the map. But the second Varangian prince moved his capital to Kiev. The name of this Viking state, the first Russian state, is called Kievan Rus. Thus, the first Russian state had its capital at Kiev, and when Russians look back to their ancient past, to the earliest days of them as an independent political unit, to the lands that embrace this first unit around present-day Russia and Ukraine were centered at Kiev. Therefore, perhaps you can understand a little bit better Putin's claim about the unity of Ukraine and Russian history. Perhaps this makes a little bit more sense. But the ancient connections between Ukraine and Russia are not purely political. In the year 882, the Varangian prince Vladimir converted to Christianity. He first sent envoys to the Catholic churches, to Jewish temples and Islamic mosques, but his delegates recommended Eastern Orthodoxy as the most beautiful religion and the one best for Kievan Rus to adopt. According to custom, Vladimir, or Saint Vladimir as he is in the Russian Orthodox Church, was baptized in the city of Kherson near the Crimea. Kherson is the only regional capital that the Russians have captured during this current invasion. That may be a coincidence, or perhaps it is not. But Kherson is the first place where a Russian ruler adopted Christianity. At any rate, Kievan Rus and Kherson, for a Russian religious nationalist, would be the cradle of Holy Mother Russia. The Russian religion began in lands that are now part of Ukraine. The desire to regain Crimea and now all of Ukraine possibly, or if you want to be charitable to what they say, probably has a spiritual component. It's easy to discount this motivation as cynical or simply imperial, but I think that if we want to be respectful of other people, we will recognize that their religious beliefs are real. And although I wonder about Putin's personal beliefs, and that this is part of the story. When Vladimir converted, though, personally, that wasn't enough for him. He didn't convert to Christianity because of its personal value, but because he wanted to build a state religion out of it. In the year 988, he issued a proclamation to all the inhabitants of Kiev to come down to the river for baptism. The pagan idols that were set up around the city were destroyed, and all who continued the old Slavic faith were punished. Those who ate during Lent, for instance, had their teeth knocked out. So thus, not only the first Russian state, but the first Russian state religion was based in Ukraine and specifically in Kiev, where the fighting has been focused, or some of the fighting has been focused. I should say parenthetically, the Ukrainian and Russian churches were unified until just 3 years ago, until 2019, when the Supreme Patriarch in Constantinople recognized the Ukrainian church as autonomous. Most churches in Ukraine are still loyal to the Russian Patriarchate, but the Ukrainian church is growing. And Putin has specifically denounced this schism, this breakdown of the Orthodox Church. So this must be part of the analysis, and I don't think that it comes up when you hear about the conflict on the news. Just briefly, this is the part where I'll really accelerate the history, but I welcome people to take my courses if they want more detail. Kievan Rus remained a political unit for about 300 years, and its existence came to an end with the Mongol invasion. Genghis Khan's youngest son was authorized to explore all the lands to the west of the Mongol Empire and control whatever he found. His army rolled over Kievan Rus and conquered Kiev in the year 1240 and forced all the Varangian princes to swear obedience. Most princes agreed to accept Mongol domination. It was pointless to resist for the most part. The Mongol invasion and the Mongol army was so effective, but with one exception, and those were the princes around Kiev. Moscow grew rich. The princes of Moscow grew rich and powerful by cooperating with the Mongols, and they eventually convinced the Russian Orthodox Church to move the seat of the church to Moscow. Meanwhile, Kiev, having an older history and perhaps more pride, chose to resist the Mongols. And over time, while Moscow grew stronger, Kiev grew weaker. Before 100 years had passed, Kiev had been absorbed into the neighboring kingdom of Polish-Lithuania. Kiev left the Russian sphere of influence for about 400 years consequent to the Mongol invasion. Although Kiev and other Slavic lands had been unified under Kievan Rus, Kiev and Moscow parted ways in the Middle Ages. This map shows how Kiev had entered. Let me show, I'll only step away from the mic for a second here. Center of lands of Polish-Lithuania, while the various principalities of the Varangian states in the different colors of green and yellow were apart. And during this period of time, from 1240 until about 1660, Kiev and Moscow were under different political regimes. So therefore, when Putin says that Ukraine and Russia have the same historical path, he's choosing to ignore several hundred years of history. During these years, Moscow became a military and economic powerhouse, slowly conquering the lands around it in no small part because of their convenient alliance with the Mongols. Meanwhile, Kiev became more integrated into Polish-Lithuania. In the mid-17th century, Poland and Russia went to war with one another. Russia won this war, and Kiev was again annexed and added to the Russian Empire. Ukraine remained crucial in the historical path, even beyond its time of incorporation into the Russian Empire as a result of this war. Peter the Great first established Russia as an imperial power in 1709 at a crucial battle at Poltava in Ukraine. This victory over Sweden was the first victory of a Russian army over a European army, and in reward for the victory, Peter was given the title of emperor. Russia became an empire for the first time as a result of this battle, and it happened in Ukraine. It's located between Kiev and Kharkov. It is, for a Russian nationalist, holy ground. Over the next 200 years or so, Russia fought a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire that gradually allowed Russia to take control of most of the lands of modern-day Ukraine. They're the areas in lighter shades of brown to the southwest of Russia. This area at the time was called New Russia, Novorossiya. Just as the English at about the same time created New England, Russia conquered these territories, or should I say, they fought with the Ottomans, defeated the Ottomans, and then gained these territories as part of the peace treaty negotiations. And by the end of the 18th century, all of Ukraine, including Crimea, was reunited with Russia inside the Russian Empire, and remained so until the year 1917. So another way of putting this is that Ukraine either belonged to Polish-Lithuania, or pieces of it were controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but there was never independent during these periods. There was always an edge of some other empire. And by the end of the 18th century, these lands have been added to the Russian Empire. Now, when the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, Ukraine was nominally independent for a few years, but it was really more of a civil war than it was an independent country with its own government. The Bolsheviks reestablished control in 1921, and Ukraine became again part of an empire, this time the Soviet Empire, until its collapse in 1991. The USSR was, in many ways, a rebirth of the Russian Empire, and Ukraine was a crucial part of that. All of this, I hope, helps us understand why Putin might feel that Ukraine is basically a region of Russia. In this understanding, Ukraine left the Russian orbit for a few centuries when the Mongols invaded, but then was reincorporated to its proper position as an edge of the Russian Empire. And likewise, Ukraine may have left the Russian orbit for 3 decades after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, but Putin wants to bring the Ukraine back in. Just as he annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, he's now, or apparently, and this may be changing even as we're speaking, thinking about recombining Ukraine with in the Russian political unit. This might help us grasp why Russia would attempt regime change in Ukraine, as its leaders repeatedly saw it in the past. Now, all this shows a pattern of Russian expansion, and I hope that I'm being charitable when I say that it shows why Putin might think that, or believe that, sincerely believe that Ukraine and Russia are basically the same unit that has been separated through a historical accident. But it doesn't necessarily explain why the Ukrainians would want to resist so fiercely. If Putin is correct, then they should have welcomed him with flowers, ostensibly the way that some people expected to happen when the invasion began. Obviously, the Ukrainians are resisting quite fiercely. And so I want to explain that too. I want to explain the other side of the coin. The short answer is this: Russian political control, and especially Soviet political control, was often very harsh and centralized. And the invasion apparently has convinced them or reminded them that Ukrainian independence would be preferable. A key episode that illustrates Russian control and the way that Russians exert control over edges of their empire is the tragedy of collectivization, an episode that I think most people in the United States are not very well aware of. So I'll just talk about it now. In 1929, after winning the Russian Civil War and consolidating power inside the country, the Bolshevik leadership of the Soviet Union under Stalin, decided to collectivize agriculture. That is, that they decided to exert state control over the farms of the Soviet Union. The October Revolution had already made private ownership of land illegal, but throughout the 1920s, peasants in the Soviet Union still had the freedom of choosing what to sow, when to harvest, and whether to sell their harvest or not, whether to sell it for available prices or store their grain for another year. And in the late 1920s, peasants were increasingly choosing to hold on to their grain. They'd rather have a storehouse full of grain with a chance to sell it in the future than exchange it for Soviet cash, which was not very useful because there weren't many things in Soviet stores. It was more useful for them to put their grain away for another year. And this led to grain shortages. By the end of the 20s, Soviet cities were seeing real, meaningful food shortages. There was rationing of important staples. And the Bolsheviks felt they couldn't have this. They couldn't have their food supply at the mercy of the peasants. The revolution had not been made in 1917 so that peasants could rule. So they announced a policy of collectivization of agriculture. They forced the peasants to join collective farms. They forced the villages to sign papers saying the villages were now entities called collective farms. They were wholly owned by the state, including all the animals and all of the personal agricultural implements, even if they were just rakes and hoes. And that furthermore, that when the harvest came in, the harvest must be delivered in total to the state. Those who refused were called kulaks, or fists, and they were deported. The rest were forced to turn over their harvests at the end of each year. Life on these collective farms was harsh. The peasants were promised tractors, but these did not arrive for decades. The motivation, after all, for collectivization was not to make life for the peasants more pleasant. The point of collectivization was to squeeze the peasants for their excess produce and to force them to participate in the Soviet economy on the terms of the Soviet government, not on the peasants' own terms. The Soviet Union wanted to industrialize, it wanted to modernize, and to do that, they needed a reliable flow of food. They did not need the peasants deciding when to sell their crops. So at the point of a gun, the Soviets chose to collectivize agriculture in the late 1920s. Collective farms were issued quotas that were far in excess of what the farms had produced in the years before collectivization. The idea was that the Soviets they believed that the land could produce more if the peasants were properly motivated. So they gave them very high quotas that the peasants thought in many cases were fanciful. And in return, they were promised wages. They were not promised a part of the harvest, they were promised wages if they met their quotas. Very often in the first years of collectivization, the peasants who didn't really believe that, who believed that they were in a position of power versus the Soviets because they controlled the food, often claimed that they couldn't deliver the grain because there had been a bad harvest, or because their crops had failed, or the quotas were too high. And they assumed that the Bolsheviks would rub the backs of their necks and go away. So they thought would happen. It had happened that way in the 20s, after all. But in fact, very often the peasants had chosen to hide their grain in their barns or in other places. They expected the Bolshevik commissars to leave upon hearing the bad news. But the Bolsheviks with collectivization clearly intended to show they meant business. They conducted searches, they interrogated neighbors, they threatened, they cajoled, they deported people who didn't participate. And they found the hidden grain. And when they found it, they took it all. And they punished those who hid the grain as enemies of the state. The result of this policy was a man-made famine called the Holodomor. All of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Holocaust, but you've probably never heard of the Holodomor, or maybe most of you. The words sound similar. They happen at roughly the same time, roughly the same place on the surface of the earth, but they're entirely different historical events. They're not related aside from the desire of central states to exert their influence. It was illegal to travel to Ukraine during the early years of collectivization. There was a total news embargo. So the Soviet government was able to keep news of what was happening in Ukraine and all the agricultural lands of the Soviet Union a fairly well-kept secret. One Western journalist was able to sneak in and reported seeing dead bodies all over the streets. He reported people simply collapsing in front of him as he walked down the sidewalk. But at this time, the Soviet government denied everything. Because the food was taken away, this episode met its crescendo in 1932 with a terrible famine. There are official records for 1.4 million deaths, but analyses of demographic trends make the likely estimate somewhere between 2.5 and 10 million people. The worst part of this, of course, is it was intentional. This was not an accident. This was not a miscalculation. This was not a natural disaster. The state took the grain away with the intention of teaching the peasants a lesson and teaching them that if they did not cooperate with the Soviet government, that they would die. There were ugly reports of cannibalism throughout Ukraine and the other agricultural belts of the former Soviet Union. And you can see in the eyes of the woman here, who's apparently selling body parts, perhaps those of her children, that something has changed, that the hunger has done something to her that we all can hope never happens to us. When you hear about Ukrainians fighting for every inch of land in the current invasion, it is in part because of the Holodomor. It is because of this. For Ukrainian nationalists, nothing like this can ever happen again. The president of Ukraine has said that if they lose this war, that the Ukrainian people will pay for generations. And I'm sure that he's thinking about this. I should mention, to be fair, that the Holodomor is often seen in Ukraine as an ethnic policy, that it is often referred to as a genocide in Ukraine today. And I think to be fair, I need to push back against this. It was not an ethnic policy. It was not an attempt at genocide. What it was a class-based policy, an attempt to control the agricultural sector. And it so happens that much of the Ukraine was an agricultural sector. But similar developments happened in other parts of the Soviet Union, in the southern parts of Russia and also in Central Asia. It just so happens that Ukraine is a very agricultural region. So a policy aimed at controlling agriculture would fall most heavily on Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalists dispute this claim. If there were one here, he or she would say this was genocide. And they mistrust Moscow as a result. Whether it was genocide or not, a person interested in Ukrainian nationalism would say this is how Moscow treats its empire, how it treats its peripheral regions. It makes decisions based upon what's good for the center and not what's good for individuals. During World War II, there were partisan bands of Ukrainians who fought against the Soviet troops. Some actually fought against the Soviets and the Nazis. They were fighting for Ukrainian independence, in no small part in order to free themselves from what would surely be oppression from whichever army won. And after the war, the Soviets hunted all of these partisan bands down. They hunted the guerrillas and they executed them. Their families were arrested and deported to Siberia. And incidentally, Putin has announced that after the special operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine is concluded, there will be reprisals for those who resist. The Ukrainian army fighting today is no doubt aware of this development as well. The Ukrainians are also aware of the many instances in the second half of the 20th century when Russians regarded their near abroad with what we might call a lack of consideration. Once autonomy has been lost, it's very difficult to regain it. For instance, in 1956, in Hungary, occupied by the Red Army after World War II, there were revolts against communist economic and political domination. And after some discussion, the Soviets chose to roll in the tanks. In 1968, Czechoslovakia, also occupied by the Red Army after World War II, introduced a new policy called socialism with a human face, to reform communism, not to reject communism, but to reform it and increase level of consumer goods and freedom of expression. And after a few months of dithering, the Soviets rolled in the tanks. In the late 70s, there was Islamic-based religious rebellion on the just to the south of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and facing a disruption on its southern border, the Russians, after some dithering, chose to roll in the tanks. In 1991, the Soviet Union broke up into 15 pieces. Soon thereafter, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee of its territorial security. And during the 30 years since then, Ukraine has been drifting toward Europe and away from Russia economically and culturally. During that same time period, many countries formerly in the Russian or Soviet sphere of influence, such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, and there are others, have requested to join NATO and have been granted NATO status, threatening the Soviets, or threatening the Russians with the loss of their former Soviet empire. Ukraine has been expressing an interest in joining NATO as well. And 1 month ago, Putin decided that these trends had gone far enough, that the unity of the Slavic people should be reestablished while there was still time to do so. The Ukrainians apparently do not agree. Putin has made an ethno-nationalist argument that because Russia and Ukraine have a shared culture, history, religion, and language, that they should be united in the same political unit. By way of analogy, however, England and the American colonies largely shared a common culture, Protestant religion and language, and yet in 1776, the colonies nevertheless sought independence and sovereignty. This is perhaps a useful analogy for the current situation. Ukraine is fighting a nationalist war of independence, and Russia is fighting for the retention of empire. What happens next? We'll have to watch together. I welcome any questions from the audience. Not really. I mean, it could, in the sense that at times he has nodded toward the Baltics as being land that is properly Russian, but it's not. That's not Russian land so much as a part that was always part of the Russian Empire. But there are only 3 countries that he puts in this category. He calls Russia a triune nation, which has, of course, that religious overtone. That is Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Those are the 3 that are the core of the Slavic lands for him. The other places would be places that Russia has administered and deserves to administer again. That's why people worry about what might happen with the Baltics, for instance, or parts of Poland were part of the Russian Empire. But properly speaking, he reserves that for those 3 countries. I don't know. You want to do it, Julian? Well, I guess let's go left to right if that's okay. Sir? That's an interesting question. I guess you might be thinking about Manchuria in the very, very far east. That's probably so. Although in the 16th century, when Russia colonized to the east and added Siberia and the Far East to its imperial control, these areas were basically unpopulated. When I say unpopulated, I mean unsettled by agricultural peoples. There were small peoples, herding peoples who lived there. But the area wasn't very Sinified at the time, with the exception of the lands, the very, very far extreme southeast of Russia, which would be near Manchuria. And so those places, there's some dispute over those places, but there was no part of Siberia that was really Sinified aside from that borderland of Manchuria. Did that answer your question to satisfactory? Well, it wouldn't, yeah, not just ironic, it would also probably be atomic because those are nuclear powers. I hope it doesn't come to that. But yeah, they probably could. I mean, they could use a similar, that's the problem with ethno-nationalist arguments. You can say that land is properly mine and I'm going to take it. And then it becomes a quarrel about who owns what. Yes, like I said, I'll go left to right. So if that's okay. Yes, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The fellow asked me whether the current episode could be seen as a repeat of the Cold War. And I think obviously it could in the sense that the participants are the same, but what the terms of the debate or what people are fighting over is, I think, is different enough that it would only be a Cold War in terms of similar participants and similar tactics. But the way that I interpreted the Cold War uh, was in no small part was trying to figure out what part of European values to embrace. And the Soviets had one in which equality was the most important one, and the West had one in which liberty was the most important value. And that's not the contest now. And the contest now is something about if it is ideological at all and not just imperial and geopolitical, it has something to do with the contest between liberalism and and central authority and about social order, I suppose I might put it away. I know I might need to unpack that more, but I think the answer is probably yes in terms of tactics and who's fighting, and no in terms of what it means. That's what I'd say. Okay, fellow there with his hand raised up. Could it escalate to a third world war? Is that what your question is? Yeah, yeah, it could. That's why the United States I think, has been so cautious in its moves over the past month, with the exception of 9 words. The United States has been very circumspect about giving very clear it signals about what it will and won't do. And one of the first things that the president said was that United States troops will not be fighting in Ukraine. And that was to prevent that. That's why perhaps you recall from a couple of weeks ago when there was a plan to transfer jets to Ukraine from Poland through NATO, and that plan was canceled because it's just, well, no one knows how easy it is to escalate a local war to a regional war to a nuclear war, and no one really wants to find out. So as a result, people, uh, that has led to an abundance of caution from some people's perspective with respect to how people are helping Ukraine, how the Western countries are helping Ukraine. But I guess I'll put it this way, that if Ukraine were helped more actively and it led to a nuclear war, which is what World War III means, then the Ukrainian people wouldn't be suffering any more in that than they are now. I mean, they would be suffering more. And also people like Fiona Hill have said that we already are in World War III. It's just, we're expecting to look like World War II, or expecting to look like World War III in the movies. We're expecting to look like that passage from the Terminator movie or from the movie The Day After. And the fact that we're expecting a war like that might be blinding us with the fact that World War III has already begun. And it's just looks different than what anybody would expect it to have done. In the back there, please. That is a very, very good question. And it's a question that's been puzzling Soviet historians for decades. She asked, to what degree do the Russian people support Putin's argument, his ethno-nationalist argument about support for the war? And the answer is it's extremely difficult to answer that question because most people in Russia choose to get their news through the television, and the state media controls all television channels. The last few independent channels were knocked off the air at the beginning of this conflict. So it's very controlled about what people hear. That said, I've seen polls, a recent number of polls, saying that between 68 and 80% of the Russian people support the ongoing action in Ukraine. The problem is no one knows what they mean when they say that. Do they mean that they support small-scale incursions in eastern Ukraine? Do they know about what's happening in Mariupol that's been bombed to dust? Do they know about attacks on, say, the Holocaust monument in Kiev? It's hard to know what people know. And then furthermore, when you live in a society in which in which dissent has been criminalized, to go onto the streets of Russia and hold up a blank white piece of paper will lead to your arrest. It's hard to know what people mean when they say, yes, I support the action. So to answer your question, it would appear that they do, but B, we don't know when they say they support it, what they mean. And also we don't know if they mean it or they are trying to give the correct answer. Trying to find out what people think in an authoritarian society is famously difficult. And all you can do is talk to your friends. And the friends that I have are the ones who will be willing to talk to Western people, and they don't support it. But that's a minority, I think. That said, when the body bags start to come back, things may change. Well, yeah. Oh, that's counterfactual. I suppose that's an interesting question, and it's something that no one can answer, I think. It's hypothetical. But I don't think that Putin is, and I never think that in situations like this, that the leader of a country has managed to sort of take over by gaining some super weapon and controlling the rest of the population. These things happen because there's a deep historical reason for Putin or for Hitler or whoever. And such that an assassination of the figurehead is not going to change the ground from which that person emerged. So I think that it's impossible to know what would happen if there was suddenly be a regime change. And maybe it probably would be somewhat different, but at the same time, he's acting in a way because he represents the way that many Russian people think, especially Russians who are attracted to the halls of power. So I don't think it's just him. Although there are rumors that during COVID he has been isolated in the Kremlin, afraid to talk to other people because of fear of infection, and doing so has put him in a very small bubble, has changed his thought patterns. So it could be that he doesn't represent specifically how people think, but he's not an anomaly. He reflects deeper historical and cultural trends. I think that's a fair way to put it. Yeah, the woman behind there. In my opinion, what's the way out of this? This is predict the future. Yeah, I want to say this in the most respectful way possible. This is the third time I've given a version of this talk, and people always want to know what's going to happen next. I don't know. I have no idea. I think probably based upon the news of the last few days, what is going to happen is that that Russia is probably going to annex those two republics in the east, Luhansk and Donetsk. And Ukraine is going to make a vow that it will not seek to join NATO. That's probably my best guess, but that's sort of what I would do if I were in the negotiations. And I wouldn't have expected that Putin was going to invade. I was very surprised by that. I thought that was an unwise play. I thought there were things he could get almost for no cost if he had been cautious, but he decided instead to go for full regime change for the reasons I think I've sketched out here. So if I were to guess, I would say that would be most likely, is that there are talks right now. I read today that Zelensky and Putin are actually talking about meeting in person. Who knows? And if so, the terms of the negotiation would probably be something like that. But that's how I would negotiate them. That's what seems logical to me. Those two people have a different sense of the meaning of the conflict. Zelensky might say, to give territory after an illegal invasion like this would be unthinkable. It would only invite them to do it again. And Putin might say, we can crush you like a bug whenever we want, so we'll take more than that. They'll take the entire southern strip, which is mostly Russophone. So I guess it's a long way of saying, I don't know. I can only guess what I think would be most logical. But logic hasn't always played a key role in this event. Absolutely.
Just drawing off what you said, that said, it seems clear that the majority of Ukrainian citizens want to be Ukrainian. What were some areas for those Ukrainian citizens to see themselves as
Yeah. Well, I think that's another question that is really difficult to answer. Oh, I'll repeat the question. Well, it was, what are the prospects for the people who live in Ukraine who think of themselves as culturally Russian? That's a difficult question, and it's at the very center of the conflict because people, Well, it leads to the discussion of the concept of nationalism and national identity, which is difficult to pin down. And I could give a discussion about that would enlighten nothing. But I guess I would say that from what I can tell, even in the eastern regions like Kharkov, the second largest city in Ukraine, is a Russophone city. It's a city that always sympathized with Russia. And anecdotal reports, which may be false, indicate that this invasion has changed minds. That people are that people even who have close connections with Russia and speak Russian have been converted, so to speak, by this experience, by seeing for the first time what it's like to be at the receiving end of a Russian imperial play rather than watching it happen on their behalf. So it may very well be that this episode is going to catalyze a greater Ukrainian nationalist sentiment. That's one of the interesting things about this miscalculation of Putin, is that it's done so many things that he would never have wanted, like strengthen NATO and strengthen Ukrainian nationalist sentiment and so forth. So to answer the question, one is either the Ukrainian nationalism is going to expand and then those people will be happy or more content in Ukraine, or it could be, as I said before, that maybe those two, especially the district closest to Russia, will be annexed, and then that would be another solution for the problem. Sure, of course.
Speaking of nationalists, how large or influential are the white nationalist groups?
The white nationalist groups in Ukraine?
It's slide.
Well, I guess it depends what you need, what the questioner means by white nationalists. I mean, does that refer to whites from the Civil War in 1918? There are still people who refer to themselves that way, people who are emigrated, but I don't think that's what the person's talking about. It's hard to know. Oh, is white supremacist groups. So what about the white supremacist groups? Well, I mean, they exist and they have an outsized conspicuousness because they like to march. They like to wave their flags. You know, 100 people marching on the street saying obnoxious things, and it seems more, they seem louder than the 1,000 people who are sitting at home watching television. And that's the way that these sort of paramilitary groups are every place. They're not a large percentage of the population. They support the Ukrainian state, and as a result, the Ukrainian state has not chosen to crack down on them very, very hard. They don't embrace them, but it's a difficult thing to say. I can think of some historical analogies that I probably shouldn't make, but they are not a large population, but they are very conspicuous because that's what these kind of groups like to be. They like to seem more powerful than their numbers. They like to intimidate. And so things like the Azov Battalion are a relatively small part of Ukrainian political life, as far as I understand, but they are an important part of the way Putin thinks about Ukrainian political life because they are so militant, and intentionally so. Yes, back there. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Are there countries that might want to join the conflict on the side of Ukraine? I mean, I should say, and I've corrected myself a few times, that to say the Ukraine is politically incorrect. That's true, and I don't mean to scold you, but to put the article "the Ukraine" implies that it is a region of Russia, whereas Ukraine implies it's an independent country. So, and I make the same mistake myself all the time. Are there any countries that want to join? Well, anyone can go join the Ukrainian army if they want to, and some people have, and apparently with not great results. But the problem with joining, with a country joining, is that most of the countries in Europe now are part of NATO, and so and NATO, Article 5 of the NATO document says an attack on one is an attack on all. So if Poland were to join, and Poland flew some jets into Ukraine and had a dogfight with a Russian jet, and then the Russian jets came back and struck Poland, well, then the NATO alliance is triggered, and then we're in World War III. So the countries that are nearest to the conflict and might have the most interest in joining are not all, but almost all part of NATO, and they're increasing the level of risk to a very high degree. That said, I've seen Polish people the Poles are the most worried about this of any country because they feel that they're next on the list, if not the Baltics. And so I've seen, if you go watch Polish Twitter, you see that they're the most adamant about supporting the Ukrainians. But as I said, Article 5 means an attack on one and attack on all. And unless they want to leave NATO, joining the war means dragging everybody else in. And everyone else would say, please, please don't do that. Yes? Pardon? I thought you had your hand up for a question. Okay. Well, I don't know which question is better. Let's go for that. You're speaking now, so go ahead. Well, yeah, that's kind of what I meant about World War III. That we're expecting either tanks and artillery pieces. The Russians are kind of fighting World War II in this conflict, and we're all glad that we don't have World War III because we've seen Terminator 2. You know, we've seen Los Angeles be incinerated. But World War III is actually, if it's going on, if you want to think of it that way, you don't have to. It has different. It's as different from World War II as World War II is from World War I. And that social media is one of the places where this is happening. We're trying to urge people to. This is a war of unmanned vehicles, or UAVs, drones, and where a weapon is Twitter and YouTube and so forth. And getting to, if people can get the word out about what happened where some atrocity was committed in Mariupol, and they can put that on Twitter and it leads the Chinese to not provide a loan to the Russians, then it's been a completely different kind of weapon, right? And the other answer to that is the entire computer-based part of the conflict is one that we're only seeing the very surface of. There's a whole lot of things that must be going on, but we don't know what they are. So this is something that the people who know aren't saying, and the people who say don't know. But undoubtedly, this is part of this new kind of 21st century warfare that actually has been going on for quite some time. And where the United States is probably, hopefully, just becoming aware of, so as to at least know what's happening, if not to adopt some of the same tactics. The answer is very much so. It's a good question. Okay, was the fellow in front of you also had his hand up? Is that right? Someone right around you. Oh, yeah, please go ahead. Uh-huh. Well, he asked about a treaty between Ukraine and China, like a protection treaty. I have to confess, I've never heard of this treaty before, but if it is as you say, then yes, that's what that treaty would mean. I think there are a lot of factors that are in place trying to prevent this conflict from escalating from local to regional to world war, and that would just be another piece of the puzzle. But I think everyone is fully aware, and Putin is taking advantage of the fact that a nuclear war is unthinkable, and that there are lots of structures that are in place to prevent people using the first one, because then the mutually assured destruction would be next. In the back, yes, please. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. She said that I've talked about history and Putin has talked about history, but there's so obviously a geopolitical aspect to this conflict, and what is what is the real motivating factor, or what's the blend? And I guess I would say to you that to prize these things apart is sort of an academic exercise, and a good one, but you can't really separate nationalism and history and geopolitics, that they're all the same. That Crimea is a place that the Russians annexed in 2014. It's a place covered in crucial Russian naval bases. It's a place that speaks Russian. It's a place that I said in the discussion is important in Russian religion. And so to try to prize these things apart and say it's 45% this and 27% that, it's impossible, because it's all mixed together. That the geopolitics is as it is because of the history and the nationalism is because of the history and so forth. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, if it seems like an evasion, but it's all united. It's the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. Yeah, please. Holodomor. Do Ukrainian students know about the Holodomor? Yes. It is it's the only place in the world where Holodomor, the memory of the Holodomor is kept alive actively, and there are monuments to it in Ukraine, and it's in the textbooks, and there are republications of documents. They've taken the archival documents stored in the Soviet archives and published them. It is a key central point of Ukrainian nationalism. And so when I emphasize it here, it wasn't a historian saying that people should remember this. This is central to the Ukrainian thinking about what it is to be part of the Russian sphere of influence. Absolutely. Ostensibly, things would look very different if it weren't for Holodomor today. Yes, in the front there. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, this is another prediction question. Is that what that is? I don't mind them. I just want to, make perfectly clear that I don't know. That these areas have been partially that these two provinces in the far east of Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, are Russophone, and they have been since 2013 the sites of a kind of a guerrilla civil war where there are unofficial Russian military units there fighting with, and they say they're there to defend the Russian-speaking people. They think they have right on their side, and Ukraine has been trying to evict them, but because it's not an official kind of war, it's more like a police action. It's difficult for them to carry it out. I only say that because there are already troops there. So, and it's also more culturally Russian. So it would have been relative. And also, I'm glad I remember this. In the days before the invasion, Putin recognized these two provinces as independent. He recognized them as independent countries. He's the only country that has done this, that these two regions are actually their own countries now from the Russian point of view. And if they are independent, then the next thing they can do is have a vote and vote to join Russia. And they did this with Crimea in 2014, and it had the veneer of legality in such a way that the West could do nothing about it, or at least didn't want to do anything about it. And I think it would have been pretty easy to do that again. I think that if they had announced, they did announce that that those two provinces were independent, and there were some sanctions directly thereafter. But then the invasion happened, so we don't know what would have happened next. But based upon what we saw with Crimea, probably something very similar. There would have been a lot of hand wringing, a lot of finger wagging, and those areas would have been added to Russia. And then if you went to Google Maps in the United States, you would have seen those districts as part of Ukraine. But if you went to Google Maps while in Russia, you would have seen them as part of Russia, which is how Crimea is. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's the same question, but put to me in a sharper way, isn't it? Does he represent the will of the Russian people? Well, that is a very difficult question to answer. I don't think that the Russian people are very excited about seeing the cities flattened, and that's why they don't see the cities flattened. I mean, there are very few pictures from Mariupol getting out, and so. I guess it's the same question, the same answer as before. I think that most people support what they're seeing on television news, who watch television news. I think people who choose to get their news sources from other places, namely the internet and so forth, don't. But most people in Russia watch Russian news for television the same way that most people in the United States watch American TV for their news. And those people probably, I should say, this did not start yesterday. the lead up to the war did not begin in January of 2022. I was in Russia in 2013 and 2014, and the news then was already talking about Ukraine being infiltrated by Nazis. The Russian media has been filled with this trope for a very, very long time. It didn't happen, and they've sort of become habituated to the idea that Ukraine is a country that is dangerous, that is under the sway of Nazis, and that even has a potential to invade Russia and certainly to hurt the Russian people who live in Ukraine. So, and because the people who believe that, and for most, there's probably no reason not to. It's a message that feels good, it sounds good, and it's been substantiated every day in the news for 10 years. They probably believe it, but it's one of those questions about who believes what. They're very hard to answer. All you can do is based upon polls. Polls say yes. Yes? Sure. And please remind me to say the question again, because I think I missed a couple. Thanks, John.
And essentially, why are they praying now? Start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Do I need to repeat that question?
Yeah, just
Okay. The question was, why start the war now? Was there some reason, like the Germans before World War I, they thought they had a moment of opening? I don't think anyone has a good answer for that question yet. There was nothing that was about to happen. Now, that's not true of the recent flare-up between Ukraine and Russia in 2013 and 2014, when Ukraine was about to sign some trade deals with EU, and then was forced to cancel them. And then one thing led to another. There was a precipitating factor. There doesn't seem to be any such precipitating factor in this instance, other than I think that maybe we'll look back the way that people look back to World War I and World War II, and seen that, well, the Ukrainian army has been growing in strength and ability over the last 8 years. It wouldn't have been able to do what it's done if it were it not for that fact. They've been spending the last 8 years preparing very actively. And I think probably Putin knew that. So it could be that in years to come, we will see that the Russians believed that the Ukrainians were only getting stronger over time, and that this was the time to strike. It could be that. I saw an interview with the defense minister of Ukraine predicting that Russia didn't want to see the increasing cultural drift, and not just cultural, but economic drift and religious drift of Ukraine away from Russia. And he predicted that there would be the most dangerous time for war would be 2021 or 2022. He made this prediction in 2019. He said he predicts the Russians are going to feel like they have to do something about it in these 2 years. So I think that people with an eye really close to the ground living there did see that it wasn't any precipitating factor, but just if we don't, more of a we don't stop this now, it will be too late sort of calculus in mind. I think that's the answer, but historians will know in 50 years or so. Yeah. It is future historiography for us. John, you have a question? Where does Putin see himself in Russian history? Is he Stalin? No. Is he Peter the Great? No. I think he's somebody who wants to see this is my opinion. I think he wants to restore the empire. He famously said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. He thinks that and I think honestly, this is what I'm trying to say, I think sincerely thinks that the collapse of Slavic unity is something to be lamented. And so I think that he sees himself, I'm not sure that Stalin or Peter the Great started the Russian Empire, and Stalin, Stalin was a Bolshevik, right? He had his own ideas. So I don't think either one of those models works well. I think he sees himself as a restorer of empire, and there isn't really and a restorer of the ethnic unity, which we over here can sort of roll our eyes at if we want to. But other people's ethnic identity is is either cute or tragic, and our ethnic identity is sacred, right? It's easy to see things like that. I think it's as important to him as it is to anybody, and as such, that's, well, if you want to, if you type in type in Putin, July 20th, 2021, he put his opinion on the internet, and I think it's a very very slanted view of history, but it spells out exactly what he thinks. And so, you don't have to take my word for it. I think that he thinks that he's putting right something that history broke. He's fixing something history broke, is what he thinks he's doing. Sure.
Question from out there, and we'll maybe 2 more questions, and then anyone who can stick around and chat.
Sure. Absolutely.
If there's a world out there still. Question very brief. Could you please discuss the role of China in this conflict?
Yeah. Well, I need to bring in do I need to repeat the question? What's the role of China? Yeah, that's a whole nother lecture. And also, it's not really my specialty, so I can only speculate as a news reader, in the sense that if there is this new, I do like thinking about this kind of thing, but it's not my historical specialty, that if there is a new political dynamic emerging that will drive geopolitical tensions in the 21st century, it won't be the one that drove the 20th century tensions, which is the one between free market capitalism and liberal and centralized communism. This one seems to be more about liberty versus order. And the Chinese, they would like to have Taiwan back, and so they probably would like to follow something. If Russia can reincorporate Ukraine, China would probably like to add Taiwan. Maybe they see some similarities there. And the other thing is that the political economy of both countries is fairly similar, in that both of the countries are kind of built on the concept that centralized decision making is stronger than liberal democracy, which tends to be weak and floppy and slow to react. And also, liberal democracy tends to be socially repellent to people who like order. Putin finds the laxity of Western values to be disagreeable, and so I think that they share kind of an idea about the need for a strong country to have strong centralized rule. That they're not apologetic about an authoritarian center, and so there are some natural affinities there between Russia and China that might make them into an allied bloc. They have a similar idea of how to run a government, a similar idea of how to run an economy, although the Chinese are much better at it than the Russians are, and a similar idea about spheres of influence and having buffer states around them. That said, they tried that before. China and the Soviet Union were allies after 1949, and that didn't work out well at all. They went to war in 1969, and we can be glad it didn't get out of hand. So, so I think that if this is what the questioner is asking, there's reason to think that China and Russia are going to grow together because they have some similarities, but at an even deeper historical level, they don't trust each other. They don't really like each other all that much on a cultural level. They both think the other one should be subordinate to them and isn't. And so there's going to, at a different level, there's going to be tensions. But in the short term, China will probably, and Russia will probably find things to cooperate on. Yes, in the back? Yeah, it doesn't work out well at all, does it? Right. She said, how can the Russians say that the Ukrainian government is Nazified when Zelensky is Jewish? Well, that kind of logic is not really helpful for the propaganda. There is no answer to it exactly, other than they say that not to take I've seen a few answers to this question. One is that the term Nazi shouldn't be construed too closely. It doesn't have to be Germanic, Aryan, anti-Jewish to be Nazi. That Nazi can be a more embracing term that stands against Russian goodness, something like that. And as such, Nazi can sometimes just mean against us, which is what I was alluding to earlier. That's one way to do it. that if you understand the term Nazi too narrowly, that only Nazi Germany would qualify, and that's not helpful. That's one way they do it. Another way they do it that Zelensky is lying. That Zelensky is not actually Jewish, that it's a trick, and that when he talks about his family members who were killed in the Holocaust, that is part of the very clever Nazi trick. Those are at least two ways to do it. There may be more, but those are the two that I've seen. The best way to deal with it is just not to talk about it. It's easier to say they're Nazis. And Zelensky is Russian speaking, and he didn't speak Ukrainian natively. So his background is, I don't want to imply anything I don't mean to. His background is not he wasn't a Ukrainian nationalist his whole life. And that makes some people wonder what his real background is and speculate about it. And then, of course, you can use social media to gin up any kind of rumor. One person says this and one person says this, and they respond. And pretty soon it's happened. So those are the two ways I've seen response, but they're not good responses. Yeah. Last one? Okay, yes? He asked me, but I'll ask again what he means. Are there any groups or parties that I think are at the root of this? Do I think that there's something behind this that is making this all happen? Putin thinks so. Putin thinks that Ukrainian nationalism is not real. He thinks that the Nazis have taken over the government and they've been put up to it by the West. He sees in all of this a conspiracy. And like all good conspiracies, that can't be disproven. That's certainly his theory. And I remember when I lived in Russia in 2013, and one of the Maidan rebellion occurred. My friends in Russia told me that entire thing was fake. That all of the anti-government protests and demonstrations were astroturf, and they were manufactured by the West to cause trouble. And when people say things like this, it's really difficult to know. Whether what's the difference between somebody who claims to be a nationalist and someone who's a foreign agent paid to say they're one? It takes a kind of insight that is very difficult to get unless you know that person on a personal basis. But I think that what's happened since has been kind of an indication of where it really is, isn't it? I mean, if Ukrainian nationalism were just propped up by the West, kind of a trick, kind of a sham, I don't think you'd have seen the resistance that just occurred over the last month. So I think I know more about the, in quotation marks, falsity of Ukrainian nationalism after seeing the world's second largest military stopped in its tracks by people who don't want to see it proceed.
Don't forget to grab a sticker on your way out so that you will avoid. And in that spirit, I would also like to present Dr. Brain the very coveted Institute for Humanities coffee tumbler.
Thank you very much for the tumbler. Thank you for your attention. And as she said, I'd be happy to stay behind and answer some questions, but I do have to go to bed tonight, so it can't go for more than 7 or 8 hours. Okay. Thank you very much.
I know you would have, but you get a tumbler because and I know you will, and it will help show that humanities everywhere. So I will let you be flooded. I'm just going to get us offline.